welcome to the truth seekers that have joined us today. I'm glad you've decided to join this online community and hope you're ready to inhale some provocative insights that will inspire and change the way you do business. My name is Mark McKelsey, and I lead the people and projects that bring you insights, shopper trends, and next practices from Global Market Development Center. For the next hour, this Infocast will help your lunch be profitable by demonstrating just how the curiosity and the power of the consumer must be at the center of your strategy. In other words, the way you've done things in the past is not the way your future success will happen. Retailers and brands, more than ever, must be adaptive and in constant flux in order to connect with evolving populations. So, how you respond to this session is important. Without further ado, let's jump into it. I'm coming to you live from Colorado Springs and have Mark Ravi from Edge by Ascential joining us from Boston today. Today's Infocast will help you understand where the future of retail payment, the front of store, the fourth wall as we call it, and how consumers in general wish to exit physical brick and mortar. And although we've seen a huge shift over the past decade from up to 20 cashiers manning a checkout to simply walking out the door and having a robot send you a bill to your phone, there's certainly no doubt that the disruption is creating concerns across the entire industry. So, what's at risk with all this change? Strategies are not well defined and impulse buying is up for grabs. As the retail landscape is going through considerable disruption, consumers are shopping traditional stores less often while they're exploring newer channels such as e-com, dollar, and limited assortment stores more frequently instead of their favorite mass or grocery. Purchasing decisions at retail are increasingly influenced by shopper demographics and megatrends, with consumers balancing wants and needs and physical health and wellness and emotional well-being. That means the assortments of tomorrow at the entrance of stores must change. New expectations are rising and trip missions and occasions are not what they were 5 years ago. So what's changed, you may ask? Well, the rapid evolving shopper channels, payment options, and food culture are fundamentally altering how and when shoppers engage at the front of the store. All the trends point to the need for a contemporized front end to exceed shoppers' expectations, while the changes are happening at a much faster pace than what most retailers can expect to react to in order to maintain the traditional checkout revenue streams and optimize the experience that they want and need. The only way to succeed is for traditional retail to identify attitudinal and behavioral changes by generation, area, income, understand the difference between times of trips during the day, know how to address a myriad of unique occasions, and certainly become more flexible by offering a variety of checkout options that local consumers deems as being relevant to their lifestyle. So, with all of that said, Mark, will you help our viewers know a bit more about what they can expect to learn today?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Mark. So today we'll talk about how we're going to see these changes in the front end really impact and repurpose the space within the store. We're going to identify shifting opportunities for impulse, and we're going to understand which categories are most impacted by this shift and how those trends will play out in the future.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to it, Mark. Before we get started and dive in, I wish to remind our viewers that we'll take questions during or after the session. Simply use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat feature, but the Q&A, please. We'll get to those at the end of the hour and answer those live. So let's get started. Back over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. So as Mark mentioned, today we'll be talking about the front of store, so the checkout area and how that will be impacted by a variety of factors, including the industry, society, and some that we'll touch on in a little bit more depth. So overall, when we look at our agenda, first I want to just talk about what the drivers of that front end evolution are. So why is this change happening, and really what are the key factors that are enabling this change? Secondly, we'll talk about some emerging front-end case studies. So specifically where we're seeing some pretty innovative but also scaled checkout techniques, largely coming from pretty much just Asia, before we just go into global best practices of how some retailers are just best executing within these innovative practices. And lastly, we'll just go through some summary and implications just so you can understand really what the key points from today's presentation are. So we'll start with the drivers. And just to set the groundwork for any of you that have seen an Edge by Ascential presentation, this should be somewhat of a repeat in that we have 4 winning strategies that we have outlined as critical to winning in an increasingly digital retail future. Now, for today, because we are talking about the physical store and checkout, we're going to largely be talking about the store of the future, but there are elements from e-commerce, supply chain, and shopper engagement that really impact this front-end evolution, including the growth of online and the availability of more fulfillment options. Now, as another just framework to set up from the start here, we categorize our external drivers that are impacting the landscape into 5 key categories: society, technology, economy, industry, and policy. For today, because we're talking about the checkout area, we're largely going to talk about societal and technological factors, and as well as how that impacts the overall industry and some of the industry shifts that are coming from that. So when we look overall at front-end evolution, it is largely driven by consumers' shifting preferences, namely for a convenient, flexible, and seamless experience. Now, there are some other drivers that we will go through, but this is the biggest reason that there is a demand for these solutions. Now, we're seeing consumers constantly prioritize their time and their experience within stores. And when we talk about a store experience or what your shopping trip is like, we know that the checkout experience is very important. In fact, 85% of consumers say that it is important to very important in terms of their shopping experience. And when you look at how to avoid a bad or slow checkout, there are 2 options here that really are new, or more, not even new at this point, but now standard replacements to traditional checkout. That being the self-checkout lanes and the self-scanning option. But notice, even more importantly, all of the other options involve that store losing sales. That's why it's critical to meet consumer needs at this point. And as Mark pointed out, it might not just be self-checkout. As we can see, that's only with about 65% of consumers. So there's still 35% that want a different sort of solution. And I think one of the biggest takeaways here is that you need to be able to meet every consumer's need by offering a wide variety of checkout options. Now, it's not just about the consumer, though, and responding to their needs. It's also about what technology is available. And we are in the midst of a real technological evolution, where we're seeing that a lot of innovative technologies are starting to clear into this early majority and even late majority and laggards point, where we're seeing that this technology is not only relevant, but it is now an inevitable part of the retail trip that will become a new standard. And it's really key to understand that how these technologies do play a role in checkout. So mobile obviously facilitates mobile payment and mobile checkout, but Internet of Things is what really enables a just walk out or truly seamless retail experience. And what we're seeing is that this emergence of tech, along with a more tech-savvy consumer base, is really driving increased adoption and trials of these new front-end technologies. And as you can see on this chart on the left, self-checkout is clearly the most adopted technology and is one of the most widely adopted and implemented checkout solutions we've seen across stores. Almost every major retailer has self-checkout in some form or another. But one thing to note is these aren't perfect. There are still a lot of flaws and there are pain points that come, which is why you need to have a wide range of options. Self-checkout is still only at 61% in terms of satisfaction. Even mobile payment and click and collect, to even more advanced, are still in the 60s, indicating that there is a significant amount of the population that does encounter pain points with these front-end solutions. And it's important to note that when you create this variety, there are a myriad of more touch points replacing the traditional front end. So it's not just, as Mark said earlier, 20 rows of 10 feet long checkouts, but we're now seeing mobile checkout, click and collect, automated click and collect, self-scan, just walk out, as well as the impact e-commerce is having with its home fulfillment. So with these new touch points, one, retailers need to understand how important they are, what is their scale, and how can I prioritize these going forward. So similar to technology, these front-end solutions are also at various stages of development and adoption. Traditional front-end is clearly all the way adopted. At this point, self-checkout is in most major retail stores. Click and collect is now reaching the point where it has become established at many top retailers, including Walmart, Kroger, and Target. But when we look at the most innovative and disruptive forms of front-end solutions, we're seeing that they're still in the very early stages. For all of the buzz around Amazon Go and Just Walk Out technology, it's still in the very early stages, with only a few stores across the country truly offering this solution. On the other hand, we also have self-scan, which, while many retailers have trialed, it has actually been pretty hard for them to scale it because of whether it's tech infrastructure issues, an over-dependence on a mobile app, or being part of that existing ecosystem within a retailer. We're seeing that these have still lagged behind click and collect and self-checkout in terms of reaching a wider audience. Now, speaking of the Just Walk Out technology, while it is still in the earlier or trial phase, the amount of investment we are seeing in the unmanned and checkoutless store landscape is really indicative of the amount of investment that is going into this space, specifically front-end solutions overall. The other key takeaway from this slide is every country that is, or every retailer on this slide is, and their trials are based in Asia, with the exception of the Amazon Go stores. So when we, a little bit later, when we look at the future of front end and some of the most innovative solutions, the vast majority of them will come from Asia, specifically because if you are looking for the future of retail, as this slide pretty well indicates, China is a great place to start. Now, as we said, this is not just about the technology and the solutions that you're going to see at the front end, but it's about the opportunities that the front end provides, namely impulse sales. What are the categories, what are the trends we're seeing in the impulse assortments at these retailers? One of the biggest pushes we've seen, and I'm sure you've seen this in your local stores as well, is there is a push towards a healthier product assortment at checkout. We're seeing that the former traditional categories have some negative connotation, whether it's a lack of health or, you know, having the tabloid magazines that aren't necessarily what parents want their kids looking at during checkout. We're seeing that there is a push to bring a more wholesome assortment to the checkout aisle. Now, we're seeing new categories such as CE, so I would encourage you, when you go on your next shopping trip, what are you seeing in the checkout aisle? And some of the things we've seen are that you're seeing more health and beauty items make their way in there. You're seeing consumer electronics, such as an iPhone charging cable and some of those quick needs there. I know in Massachusetts, personally, because of recent regulations around plastic bags, you will see reusable grocery tote bags in many supermarkets now, as that's a great, that's really, during the checkout is when consumers are thinking about that. They may have forgotten it. They don't want to be charged for those less sustainable bags. So we are seeing a gradual shift in what that impulse assortment looks like. Now, that being said, the top impulse categories are still chocolate, beverages, and candy. When we look at these categories, they account for over 75% of the impulse assortment by SKU. When we include seasonal candy, that jumps almost up to 80%. And we're seeing that seasonal products generally will keep their relevancy because that taps into a different side. Now, while we are seeing that household, healthy items, and some of these other emerging categories are taking share, overall, when we look at the total picture, the impulse categories aren't shifting nearly as quickly as it might seem based on the narrative we're often shown. Now, I mentioned seasonal candy, and that's because seasonal products will still be and continue to be relevant at checkout. When we look at some of the seasonal items, a lot of this has to do with the fact that you are making an emotional connection with the consumer. So we're seeing that you are tapping into the Christmas spirit or even the Halloween excitement that you get around those times of year, and that resonates with consumers and might get them to move into that impulse purchase at a quicker and with less thought and a lower involvement purchase. Now, while seasonal is still very important, and while this deck and this presentation will largely be around in-store checkout areas, we cannot ignore that impulse opportunities are evolving. And it has to evolve just beyond traditional checkout. When it comes to click and collect, do you have a curbside capture or a way to influence the consumers there? When it's online, do you have these prompts that encourage the frequently bought with, or we recommend based on your basket, you should buy? And I think those are very clear opportunities, along with auto replenishment, that while not the focus of this presentation, they're definitely something that's very important to keep in mind as we go through the deck, that just because we're talking about the impulse opportunity decreasing in store, that doesn't mean that it is disappearing completely. Next, we'll shift into just some of the emerging front-end case studies. So we're going to look at Asia for just some of the most innovative and scaled solutions that have been rolled out. Now, when we're talking about the leaders of innovation in retail, there are a few names that often come up. It's generally smart for us to start with the world's biggest retailer, and that would be Walmart. Walmart launched Scan and Go in China. For those of you that might not know, Walmart also launched Scan and Go in the US and then almost abruptly canceled it or withdrew that program from most of its stores because of a lack of adoption and an over-dependence on having the Walmart app, which the vast majority of consumers, even those that do predominantly shop at Walmart, do not have. When we look at China and why Walmart was able to reach more success in China, meaning that they launched this back in April 2018 and then started a full store rollout in China in November 2018. By the end of that year, Walmart China had 10 million monthly active users for its Scan and Go app, and 30% of in-store transactions were moving through this platform. Now, why could China do this so much more successfully than the US? Namely because they partnered with the right people, specifically WeChat Pay. Now, WeChat Pay has a bigger user base than I believe the entire population of the United States. Allowing Walmart to leverage that made it so that it was facilitating a more convenient and seamless shopping experience without having to force consumers to get on their app. Now, what's important to note here is that there's not much impulse assortment. There's not much fixturing for merchandising that assortment. So one of the key themes we will talk about is how these opportunities could be shrinking, especially in some of these examples in Asia. And we're also going to mainly, so Walmart, this Scan and Go is similar to Scan and Go or a self-checkout. So we'll look at a few other innovative self-checkout solutions specifically within China. And if we're talking about innovation within China, we have to talk about Alibaba. Alibaba operates 135 Fresh Shippo locations. It's offline grocery store banner, and it works with its in-house tech, Alipay, to facilitate just a smoother transition. As you can see, they do offer some merchandising ability, but for the most part, it is much smaller than the displays we're used to seeing in the US in a traditional checkout. Now, Alibaba's main competitor, JD.com, is also pushing into this innovative checkout area. Now, they partnered with WeChat Pay, similar to Walmart. You can also pay using your JD.com wallet, further tying you into that ecosystem. Now, their self-checkout incorporates facial identification, making it even easier for certain consumers to pay, as they just have to look at the camera in order for it to be tied into their unified ID across all of their personal platforms and ecosystems. Now, this is also something that isn't just unique to JD.com. Apple Pay, with its latest models of iPhone, launched Pay with Facial ID at a massive scale. And we can see that this is clearly a solution that will continue to gain traction over time. Now, pivoting slightly towards a different form of automated checkout. So even away from self-checkout where you're taking it out of the process. Now, this is Lawson's automated self-checkout in Japan. Now, one of the key differences, this is really driven by advanced technology. So there's a great video that I highly recommend. You can just throw it into YouTube and you'll find where, if you can see the basket down here, consumers actually scan goods using that high-tech basket before they place it in. Then when they come to the actual checkout, they simply just have to place that basket in this area right here before this glass container. And that actually involves bagging the groceries for you, where it pulls it into this space and then it disappears basically under the counter and comes back up inside the bag. Now, this added convenience might not seem like it's completely necessary, but it does create, it cuts a lot of costs for retailers because they don't have to have an employee bagging it. And you'll see that one of the biggest drivers behind this front-end evolution from a retailer side is often just cutting costs, because traditional checkout and that bank of cashiers is one of the biggest cost centers within a physical store. Now, within Lawson, they had it in only 10 stores in December 2018, with plans to roll it out to as many as 1,000. But by April, it was so popular that they announced that by the end of 2019, they would roll it out to all 14,000 stores in Japan. Now, in a similar vein where it does offer added convenience, but not quite at the same scale, we're seeing South Korea and 7-Eleven work on hand pay, where we're using biometric sensors to recognize consumers' handprints that they have registered at an earlier date to then pay for a quicker and more seamless checkout in South Korea. It also means that you don't need your wallet. It drives just a better overall consumer experience. Now, they haven't expanded this to many locations, but they are using it in specifically high traffic areas like the Lot Tower, and have thought about it in some of their other urban and metro stores. Now, the last Asian example that I want to talk about is when we shift all the way to the unmanned store. So we always talk about Amazon Go as the pioneer in this space, but that's really not necessarily the case. Amazon Go has 10 stores with its Just Walk Out technology. Bingo Box has over 500 stores in China. Now, these are much smaller, completely automated, unmanned stores that are compatible with both Ali and WeChat Pay, so they can tie in to that larger consumer base. Now, they don't offer much impulse assortment, but that again has to do with the fact that these stores are only 160 square feet. So the whole store is basically an impulse assortment. And we're seeing that as these solutions come out, it might be necessary that you have a separate area for impulse. It's not crazy to imagine that Walmart has a separate area, maybe next to their recycling center, that is almost a Walmart convenience store catering towards a different trip occasion. And similar to, as Mark said, really capitalizing on a specific customer group or a specific time of day where they're driving a more seamless, more automated retail solution. Now, I've talked a lot about these Asian examples, but just on a global scale, what are the best examples? What are the lessons we can take away from not just Asian players, but the Amazons, the Walmarts, the Tescos of the world? Who's doing this the best? And when we look at our global best practices, we can see, one, self-checkout is clearly a big deal. It's going to keep happening. So retailers need to use smaller fixtures to build impulse into the checkout process. And you need to fundamentally alter how you're utilizing that space. So before, you could have full rows. And if you look at the GIF on the left here, we can see at the Sweets and Snacks Expo, they're really demonstrating how to capitalize on all available space using very small fixtures tightly together, lots of color to engage the consumer, and making sure that if you're not looking at the screen for self-checkout, you are looking at an impulse category. So while this is a really great way where, and just because I know this GIF can be a little bit much, I'll just get rid of it for the time being. Looking at self-checkout, you're really seeing the marriage here of retailers trying to give consumers a more seamless checkout option and offering that seamless checkout. But they're really balancing, one, they don't have to employ as many cashiers, so it's a huge benefit to them as well from a labor cost perspective. And then on the other hand, we're seeing that they're actually getting to still recoup these impulse sales that they might have otherwise lost if they didn't correctly merchandise around the self-checkout. Now, we've talked a lot about self-checkout, we've talked a lot about innovative solutions, and while we have touched on it, we have to mention that we are talking about innovative front-end solutions. We have to talk about Amazon Go and Just Walk Out technology. Amazon Go fundamentally altered how people looked at a seamless retail experience. Amazon's planning up to 3,000 of its seamless Go stores across the US. Now, Amazon Go is also not the only player in this space. While it might be the most prominent, we're also seeing a company called Trigo Vision, which is working with Schufersal and has since expanded to many other retail partners, where they're creating a similar Just Walk Out technology or Just Walk Out tech-enabled experience. Now, the one key difference is, while Amazon is unlikely to actually license its technology to its competing retailers, Trigo Vision is a third-party software company. So they have the ability to scale this much quicker because they want to work with any and all available retail partners. Now, looking beyond just the tech solutions, how can we regain these impulse sales that we're losing? Part of it is really highlighting the impulse products. They shouldn't just be there and something you take for granted, but it should be something that catches your eye with more upscale fixturing, whether it's better lighting or using more creative displays, especially around seasonal products. These are key opportunities to drive more engagement with impulse. I also really like what Whole Foods has done here in the bottom right example. Whole Foods knows that one of their biggest trip occasions is people coming in for their hot food or prepared food lunches. So what they've done is they've actually just started putting some of that prepared food and some of the most popular items near checkout in order to just kind of market that as an easy way for them to just grab something quick to eat in the morning or during their lunch break. Now, while we are seeing that retailers need to figure out a way to recoup these impulse purchases, there are strategies that have been around for a long time that will still work with today's innovative solutions. I think one of the biggest opportunities is to leverage what we see at department stores to drive impulse sales, especially at urban stores. Now, I think I personally, both myself and my girlfriend, love TJ Maxx and Marshalls because of the treasure hunt aspect. And part of that also includes that long checkout lane. So it's a single queue strategy. So everyone stays in the same long line, which means that they all look at your full impulse assortment before they get to the checkout. I know personally, I pick up and probably put down 3 or 4 different things on my way to checkout. And we're seeing that other retailers in the food space and even mass merchandise space are starting to incorporate this same strategy. Now, there are some negatives that have to be highlighted, such as the fact that it can often appear like a much longer line as opposed to 10 medium-sized lines. So even though there is data that backs up that a single queue strategy is faster than multiple lanes, it might not necessarily be perceived that way to the customer. And another way to create a faster experience or a more seamless experience, but that one that really does not have much impulse opportunity, but does provide you that engagement with the cashier that many consumers value, is the mobile in-aisle checkout. Now, this is something that we've seen retailers use a lot around the holiday season when they're going to be the most busy and have the most traffic. So Apple has really pioneered this across all of their stores, where now all of the employees use an iPhone or iPad as their checkout portal or as their POS solution. And that's really what's used as the standard across all their stores now. And it does help that when you walk into an Apple store, you're never daunted by a huge line because you know the associate that is helping you will be able to check you out right then and there. Target has specifically done this a lot during seasonal times, while Walmart has specifically used it for certain categories that they know can be especially cumbersome to go through a traditional checkout, such as lawn and garden, where you don't want to have to wheel through 15 bags of mulch and push that and really go out of your way to follow these tight, narrow lines. So we're seeing that there are a multitude of solutions. And one example that I do want to call out as just a truly innovative and immersive example of front-end solutions is Walmart's Sam's Club Now store. Now, they launched next generation scan and go, and what they did is they actually integrated visual search and image recognition into their app so that you could have that capability at your fingertips, and it lowered the time it takes to scan an item in store from 9 to 10 seconds to only 3.5 seconds. Now, this is pretty incredible, but the biggest thing that you should take away from Sam's Club Now, and I really cannot stress this enough, you have to have the mobile app to shop at this store. Now, I know that we've talked about how certain retailers have struggled to implement this technology because of a dependence on a mobile app. But what Sam's Club is doing by making it so that this is the only way you can shop at this store is it's the only way you can get this convenience. And it allows Sam's Club to try and collect more data and map out the in-store shopping journey the same way that we do for online. You now can have traffic towards, or the equivalent of site traffic to a product, because that scan and go information serves as a proxy for that. It also means that Sam's Club has the opportunity to bridge offline and online behavior, enabling them to better tailor their assortment, operations, layout, really their full offering to best meet evolving consumer needs. Now, that brings us to the end of really the global best practices. So I want to just wrap up with what can you take away as the real take-home message or the winning message from this presentation. So one of our first key takeaways is that checkout is one of the largest sources of customer frustration in the store after out of stocks. So there is nothing worse than going through a slow checkout and breezing through the rest of your trip and then spending twice as long waiting in line. Secondly, new technologies are enabling even these large stores to reimagine checkout to deliver more speed and convenience. Now, this means that checkout evolution will be one of the fastest areas of change in retail over the next 2 to 3 years. And retailers that want to win in this space must ensure strong investment in self-checkout combined with a human investment to handle errors. Now, this means that you need to solve these pain points by creating a hybrid model between not just self-checkout, but bringing in a human who can help with some of those pain points. And that really is what this next group of takeaways is about, is that in the immediate short term, you will see more investment in self-checkout, but that does lead to some frustration compared to traditional lines. While it can be faster, the amount of times that consumers have a bagging or payment area, or the back and forth when you think you've scanned a product, you put it in the bagging area, but now it's saying that there's an unrecognized product there. These are all problems that we haven't fully figured out. The simplest answer is make sure that there is a person there to help with their experience and make it easier. Secondly, you also need someone there to help minimize shrink. Rates of shrink or theft go up dramatically during self-checkout because there isn't a cashier monitoring the full process. A more pressing issue is the fact that impulse at self-checkout requires more flexibility in fixtures, better queuing strategies, or even corralling ahead of self-checkout to create that impulse assortment before you're even checked out. When we looked at our foreign checkout solutions, we see that there is an increasingly limited impulse opportunity at the payment system or at the checkout area. Now, retailers need to recognize this and optimize new areas of impulse in store, online, and at the point of delivery or pickup. As these ecosystems are going wider, we need to understand how they impact the full store trip. And whether that includes when you're researching online using a promotion that they still might not use until in store, but really trying to drive engagement across all facets of the new engagement or new touch points and points of engagement between the retailer and the consumer. And then lastly, long-term, cashierless options are the clear future. This isn't what a lot of the candy and impulse category leaders want to hear, but it is where we're moving. As consumers prioritize this, they generally have a pretty high satisfaction level. And while there will always be a place for self-checkout and traditional checkout, this is clearly a trend that just the evidence that Amazon is willing to launch to 3,000 stores, to go from 3 stores to potentially 3,000 stores in 3 years, shows you how big of a deal this can be. And it really highlights that the largest opportunity in reinventing payment and checkout is not saving costs. It's not creating a more seamless opportunity. It's the fact that you get access to a full new range of data that can help us bridge online and offline behavior in order to better inform every decision we make. Because right now, one of the biggest trends in retail is that every decision, every initiative needs to be backed by data, everything. So creating a system that not only creates a seamless experience and creates all those other positives, but also creates a whole new data set for your in-store shopping is really going to be key going forward. That brings me to the end of this presentation. Thank you all for listening. I'd encourage you to please reach out with questions and feel free to email me if there's anything afterwards that you'd like to talk about.
Well, thanks, Mark, for your partnership in this area and working with our Education Leadership Council here at GMDC and Retail Tomorrow. We appreciate your time and the insights you've brought to this session. We do have a few questions. I'd like to go ahead and get to those. Mark, Irene is asking, how will these changes impact overall retail store operations and infrastructure?
So overall, I would say we're obviously going to see a shift around labor. Mark touched on it in his intro, and I kind of further expanded on the fact that you're going to have to not just have one standard checkout solution. So you need to have a traditional checkout area with a cashier. You need to have self-checkout with an associate there to solve those problems. Because the worst thing that can happen is for someone to give up on their shopping trip when you've already done the hard part of bringing them in their store, having a relevant assortment, and now you're losing them purely because you can't get them out the door quick enough. So I would say the biggest shift is associates may shift slightly from being a little bit more value add. That's a theme. If you've seen any of my other presentations, I bring up constantly that the role of labor is changing. But overall, retailers have to view checkout as more than just a cost center or something that you have to expend money on from a labor perspective. It really is an important part of the consumer journey. So you need to understand what your consumer wants and make sure that your current checkout offering meets all of those needs, not just the majority, really across everything, whether it's a different consumer, a different time of day, or a different trip occasion.
Yeah, and Mark, I can speak personally to that. There's times where I'll run into the store to grab something really quick on my way into work, and I don't need a cashier to ask me if I've met everything or got everything on my shopping list. But at the end of the day, when there's more dwell time and I have a longer list, I don't mind the 10-foot checkout, and I don't mind standing there for a few days. So I think retailers need to understand that there's a time, place, and occasion for everything, and that variety is really where it needs to be in the future. And again, how do we speak to some of the boomers or even the silent generation who are not up with the latest technology? If they don't understand it, we can't have an Amazon Go store. Doesn't make sense to them. So retailers need to understand that as well, and understand that it's a huge unmet opportunity for some traditional stores as well to actually to place the right people at the right place at the right time to engage with that consumer.
Definitely. I think you actually have to think about it. You made me think of this. You have to think about it as part of your assortment. It's part of your offering.
Right.
And the same way that you have to diversify your assortment to meet every consumer's need, you have to do the same thing with checkout and making sure that that experience meets every consumer's need.
Yeah, exactly. Jacob is asking, Mark, what retailers are best positioned to win in this space? I think you covered some best practices, but can you speak beyond some of that?
Yeah, so I think there are a few obvious winners. I think the one on the tip of everyone's tongue would be Amazon with the Just Walk Out. What I would encourage is the retailers that have the most diverse store operations. So someone like Walmart that operates larger warehouse stores with the Sam's Club, but also operates some more tailored super centers as well as supermarkets and neighborhood stores. I think they have a great opportunity to test and learn, unlike many other retailers. Their ability to test in China and then bring that over here is a key success. And as well as just having the resources to invest in tech across this landscape, Walmart, Amazon, and even Kroger can invest a lot more than a Stop and Shop or a Shaw's can really afford to invest, because Walmart is willing to take the risk, or a Walmart store is so big that even if they put self-checkout or a new form of scan and go in part of the store, you know that even if it doesn't work for a full day, there are still so many options that aren't going to cause a huge line or a huge buildup.
Yeah, I'll speak from my experience as well. There's Target rolled out 70 test stores throughout the nation. There's one across from the GMDC office here. If you go in different times of the day or different times of the week, there's different category focus at the front end. So you'll go in on a Saturday and it will be all about food storage, housewares, that type of thing, actually in their aisle. But the aisle next to it will be all about healthy snacks. So depending on what checkout lane you go to, it has a different theme to it, which I find quite unique, actually. And then Walgreens in Colorado has actually adopted some of the TJ Maxx strategy that you spoke about, especially through some of the HomeSense stores. But there's some test stores here in Walgreens that I've seen close to Denver where they've taken that long runway approach, and it's full of candy and GM and health and beauty, last minute items. that shoppers want, and you stand in line waiting, and you can't but help to look at this entire selection because you've got 3 or 4 cashiers waiting for you, and they take numbers. So it's a really interesting approach I've seen adopted actually in the drug channel, which I've never seen before.
Yep, we've seen the same thing with CVS, especially here in Boston in the urban locations where they're catering to high traffic. They're just trying to get consumers in and out of there as quickly as possible. Also, to your point about lanes just being tailored a little bit, we have seen that certain supermarkets, I think Wegmans, has actually tried to mirror the aisle that leads to that checkout lane a little bit, because they find that oftentimes that is where that consumer is coming from. While many consumers obviously scan lanes, many, if all the lines are equal, just go to the closest one. So if you just bought something in the candy aisle, it is likely that you might be more likely to buy candy in that, if you see that impulse assortment versus something else.
We have had another question actually come through while we've been discussing. Henry is asking, China may or may not be a pattern to follow. I was thinking the same thing because China is very different culturally, but certainly there's learnings that we can pull from it and adapt it to our own North American lifestyle. So Henry is saying many CPGs live and die by impulse sales in the US. What is the correlation to categories, culture, etc. between the US and Asia, and how does that apply?
That's a great point. China and the US definitely do have a lot of different consumer habits. The parts that I would say overlap is generally when you're looking at urban stores. So China has really perfected urban stores a lot better than the US has. When we look at grocery stores at urban locations, the amount of innovation we've seen in just the last 3 years of moving to that smaller footprint, maximizing space in store, that's something that the US is still in the early stages of, whereas most Chinese retailers know that the absolute vast majority of their sales are coming from 5 to 6 metro areas. So while US players have done that, the US is generally built a little bit more around the car shopping trip as opposed to the walk or commuting shopping trip. So in in rural locations, there won't be as high a demand for self-checkout. I think it's important for it to have a presence there, but because there is probably less of an emphasis on that busyness or time consciousness of the consumer, I would say you're going to see a lot of the correlation be in urban areas, in specific types of stores. So I don't think, every type of store is going to have these changes, but I think what China does really well is China shows us what the capabilities are. So not necessarily that everything from China is going to come here, but I think right now we don't know what's going to happen in the US, and anything that has had some success almost anywhere else is something that retailers will have to try here. And again, everything is test and learn. I know, Mark, we've talked about a number of topics here, and that's one of the key themes is just that we don't know what's going to happen, but you want to make sure you have a foothold in every possible solution so that you do still have a first mover advantage when that winning solution, regardless of market or current of demographic factors, does emerge.
Yeah, I think that's a good point as well. And I think that speaks towards the fact you don't see curbside in urban areas, but you see it more in the suburbs simply because that's how people, it's their commute to work.
Definitely.
Back and forth. And that's why curbside wins in some areas, loses in other areas. So interesting conversation. It looks like that's all the Q&A we have time for today. We're at the top of the hour. So Mark, again, I just want to say thank you to Edge by Ascential for leading this session today, opening up this new conversation in the industry, and helping us be one of the first ones to actually introduce this type of conversation, certainly to our members and our non-members of our association. So thanks again.
Happy to help.
Back to our audience, if this is the first time you're experiencing a GMDC Retail to More Infocast, I'd like to make sure that you're aware that this session and all previous Infocast events can be viewed in the archive tab on gmdcconnect.org, along with the schedule for future Infocasts. We are still building our 2020 schedule, so that schedule is actually quite light right now, but please come back in January and you'll start to see our schedule fill up. We're certainly listening to what's going on in the industry and making sure that we have not only relevant, but very provocative ideas that are coming to you on a weekly basis. If you're not a member, I'd also like to encourage you to get involved with GMDC and Retail Tomorrow. Today's Infocast is just a small sample of what members have access to. GMDC is a nonprofit, retail-owned association that helps connect people and companies to growth and opportunity in the general merchandise, health, beauty, wellness, and self-care industries. Thanks for joining us today. We hope the rest of your week is as productive as this last hour has been. Take care.